Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to be tackling a challenge that I think a lot of us can relate to, and that is learning spoken English fast. Our listener wants to know all the secrets. So we are diving deep into excerpts from Lundquist's book, Learning Spoken English, and half the time.
Ooh.
Get ready for some aha moments. Because Lundquist, he doesn't just give tips. He kind of flips the script on how we think about language learning.
That's what's so fascinating about this book. He goes beyond the usual, like vocabulary lists and grammar drills.
Right.
He dives into the nitty-gritty of how our brains actually process spoken language.
Okay, so let's unpack this a little bit. Lundquist uses this analogy about a machine, a closed-loop system, like a sprinkler with a moisture sensor. I'll admit, when I first read that, I was like, what? Like, what do sprinklers have to do with speaking English? But then it clicked, and it's actually brilliant.
Right. It seems random, but think about it. A sprinkler in a closed-loop system isn't just spraying water randomly. It's getting feedback from the moisture sensor and adjusting accordingly. Human speech works in a similar way. We don't just blurt out words. We're constantly listening to ourselves, feeling how our mouths move, and adjusting based on that real-time feedback.
So it's not just about what we've memorized. It's this constant back and forth between our brain, our mouth, and our ears. Like we're all walking, talking sprinkler systems.
Exactly. And Lundquist argues that this feedback loop is crucial for developing fluency. It's not enough to know the words. You have to train your mouth and ears to work together seamlessly. You're not a language database. You're a dynamic system.
That makes total sense. And this leads us to something Lundquist calls the proprioceptive sense. Honestly, before reading this book, I had never even considered this. It's like a sixth sense specifically for speaking.
It is. Imagine you're speaking in the dark. You still know where your tongue is, right? You don't have to see it to feel its position. That's proprioception. It's your brain's awareness of your body's position and movement. And it's super important for fluent speech. We develop this sense naturally when learning our first language, but it often gets neglected when learning a second language.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting and maybe a little controversial. Lundquist argues that traditional English classes, with all the grammar drills and writing exercises, might actually be hindering our spoken fluency.
He's not saying grammar isn't important, but his point is that traditional methods, they tend to break language learning into these separate skills, right?
Yeah.
Like grammar, writing, reading, listening. But in real-life conversation, these skills have to work together instantly and constantly. By separating them, we're not training that crucial feedback loop we were just talking about.
So for someone like our listener who's looking to learn English quickly, what does this all mean?
Lundquist is a huge proponent of speaking aloud, even if it feels awkward at first. It's the only way to activate that proprioceptive sense and strengthen those feedback loops. Think of it like learning to play the piano. You can't just read about it. You have to put your fingers on the keys and practice.
That's such a good analogy. Speaking of practice, Lundquist lays out 4 golden rules for spoken English learning. Rule number 1, as we just discussed, is speak aloud. What about the other 3?
Rule number 2 is to think in English. This is where things get challenging because it's about shifting your internal monologue, your thought patterns into English. The goal is to stop mentally translating from your native language and start thinking directly in English.
That sounds incredibly difficult. Any tips on how to actually do that?
Lundquist suggests using something called recall memory. Instead of relying on a text, try to recall phrases and sentences from memory. This forces your brain to work harder and strengthens those neural pathways. It's like flexing your English muscles. And don't worry, you can start small. Begin by labeling everyday objects around you in English. This helps you gradually shift your internal monologue without feeling overwhelmed.
So small steps, big changes. Rule number 3 seems pretty straightforward. Speak English as much as possible. But it's not just about quantity.
Right. It's about quality, too. Lundquist stresses speaking correctly right from the beginning. The more you repeat incorrect phrases, the harder it becomes to unlearn those patterns. It's like carving a groove in a record. The more you play it, the deeper that groove becomes, and the harder it is to change. So what he advocates for is a balanced approach. Controlled exercises to build accuracy, followed by freer practice to build fluency. It's about building good habits right from the start.
Which brings us to the most intriguing rule of all. Never make a mistake while practicing. Okay, that sounds impossible. How can you learn a new language without making any mistakes?
He acknowledges that you'll inevitably make mistakes, especially in the beginning. It's part of the process. But the key is to minimize those mistakes. How? By using controlled exercises, like those found in his book, where the correct pronunciation and grammar are clearly laid out. You practice these repeatedly until you can produce them flawlessly. Think of it like building a solid foundation before adding more complex structures on top.
So it's not about being perfect, but about building those good habits early on. Now, speaking of building blocks, let's talk about verbs. Get this. Lundquist says most of us are learning verbs wrong, and it's holding us back.
He really goes all in on verbs. He dedicates a whole chapter to them, and his approach is pretty unique. He believes we should learn all forms of a verb simultaneously. Present, past, future. All the conjugations.
Wait, really? That seems so counterintuitive. Wouldn't that be totally overwhelming for a learner? It's like drinking from a fire hose.
It might seem that way at first, but Lundquist argues that it actually makes it easier to remember in the long run. Instead of learning isolated bits and pieces, you're getting a grasp of the whole system. You're learning one core concept, the verb's meaning, and then applying it to different situations and time frames. It's like seeing the blueprint before you start building. You understand how the different parts fit together, which actually makes the learning process more efficient.
So instead of memorizing a bunch of isolated words, you're understanding the verb as a complete system, like a little machine with all its moving parts. That actually makes a lot of sense.
Exactly. This approach also helps learners develop a feel for the language. Instead of just memorizing rules, they start to intuit how verbs work, how they change based on context. It becomes less about following a recipe and more about developing an instinct for how the language flows.
It's like learning to dance. You don't just memorize the steps. You learn the rhythm, the flow, the feeling of the music. Speaking of real-world applications, Lundquist has a somewhat unusual suggestion for practicing: reading newspapers aloud.
He's all about using real-world materials to practice. He argues that newspapers are a goldmine of authentic English. You encounter new vocabulary, idioms, and sentence structures that you might not find in textbooks. It's like getting a taste of the language as it's actually used, not just the textbook version.
But isn't just reading a newspaper, even out loud, kind of a solitary activity?
That's where reading aloud comes in. By reading aloud, you're not just passively absorbing information, you're actively engaging with the language. You're practicing your pronunciation, your intonation, your pacing. It's like giving a performance, which can be both challenging and rewarding.
So it's about bringing the language to life, making it an active experience. That makes a lot of sense. And I imagine having a good audio recording of the text can be really helpful for this, right?
Absolutely. Having a model to listen to, especially a native speaker, can dramatically accelerate your progress. It helps you refine your pronunciation and intonation, making your speech sound more natural and fluent.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground already, but we're just getting started with Lundquist's approach. Stay tuned as we continue our deep dive into the world of spoken English learning.
Before we move on, there's one more crucial point that Lundquist makes about how we learn.
Right.
He highlights the difference between learning in isolated chunks versus learning in a more integrated, holistic way.
So this is where the whole, learn all verb forms at once thing comes back in.
Exactly. Lundquist argues that traditional methods, they often present verbs piecemeal. Present tense one week, past tense next, and so on. It's like trying to assemble a puzzle without seeing the whole picture.
Okay, I'm starting to see the connection here. Instead of memorizing isolated facts, you're seeing the patterns, connecting the dots. Kind of like if you're learning to bake a cake, you wouldn't just study flour one day, eggs the next. You need all the ingredients working together.
That's a fantastic analogy, and that's exactly what Lundquist wants us to do with English verbs. By learning all the forms at once, we're developing a deeper, more intuitive understanding of how the verb functions as a whole.
So it's not just about memorizing conjugations.
Yeah.
It's about internalizing the patterns and relationships between different verb forms so you can use them naturally without having to think about it too much.
Precisely. And this concept of intuitive understanding, of feeling the language,
Yeah.
rather than just memorizing rules, is central to Lundquist's approach.
And speaking of feeling the language, that brings us back to his emphasis on spoken practice.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. He argues that speaking aloud engages your whole body in the learning process. You're feeling the sounds, the rhythms, the intonation. It becomes a much more immersive and a multi-sensory experience than just reading or writing.
Okay, so if I'm understanding this correctly, we need to combine this integrated learning approach, like with verbs, with lots of active spoken practice. But where do newspapers fit into all of this?
Newspapers, for Lundquist, are a bridge between the structured practice of exercises and the free-flowing nature of real-world conversation.
Because they're full of authentic language, like is how native speakers actually use English.
Exactly. Newspapers are a treasure trove of vocabulary, expressions and sentence structures you might not find in textbooks. It's like stepping out of the classroom and into the real world of English.
But isn't just reading a newspaper,
Yeah.
even out loud, kind of a solitary activity?
It can be. But Lundquist has a clever twist on it. He suggests recording yourself reading a newspaper article aloud and then comparing it to a recording by a native speaker.
Whoa, that's like having a personal language coach. Right in your living room, you can hear the differences
Yeah.
and work on refining your pronunciation and intonation.
Exactly. It's a fantastic way to identify areas where you can improve and start sounding more natural and confident when you speak.
I love that idea. It's so practical and actionable. And speaking of practical,
Yeah.
we have to address that mind-blowing rule of Lundquist's. Never make a mistake while practicing. Seriously, how is that even possible?
He acknowledges that it's an ideal to strive for, not a reality we can always achieve. We all make mistakes, especially when we're starting out. But the point is to minimize those mistakes from the very beginning.
So it's not about being perfect. It's about setting a high bar and aiming for accuracy right from the get-go. But how do you avoid those ingrained mistakes, those grooves in the record, if you're practicing on your own?
That's where those controlled exercises become really valuable. They provide that structured environment where you can practice repeatedly and get comfortable with the correct forms before venturing into the wilds of free conversation.
It's like training wheels for your English.
That's right.
But eventually you have to take them off and ride.
Right.
That's where finding a language partner
Yeah,
or a conversation group can be so helpful.
absolutely. Having someone to practice with who can provide feedback and gentle correction is invaluable for taking those next steps towards fluency.
It's all about finding that balance between structured practice and real-world application. And of course, as Lundquist emphasizes, persistence is key. This isn't a sprint, it's a marathon. There will be days when you feel like you're making no progress, days when you just want to give up. What advice does he have for staying motivated and keeping the momentum going?
One of the biggest things he emphasizes is setting realistic goals. Don't expect to become fluent overnight. It takes time, effort, and consistent practice. Break down your learning journey into smaller, more manageable steps and celebrate those small victories along the way.
So it's about finding joy in the process, not just fixating on the end goal. But sometimes, even with the best intentions, we can lose sight of why we started learning in the first place. What does Lundquist say about rediscovering that spark, that motivation to keep going?
He reminds us to connect back to our why. Why did we embark on this journey in the first place? What are our goals? What do we hope to achieve with fluency in English?
It's about remembering the doors that language can open, the connections it can foster, the opportunities it can create.
Exactly. And it's about believing in ourselves, believing that we have the capacity to learn, to grow, to achieve fluency, even when it feels challenging.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about how to learn spoken English. What about the traditional approaches? Lundquist seems to have some strong opinions about how those methods can sometimes fall short.
He does. He believes that the traditional emphasis on grammar rules and written exercises can actually hinder spoken fluency. It's like learning to swim by reading a book about swimming. You might understand the theory, but you'll never actually learn to swim until you get in the water.
So it's about getting out of our heads and into the real world of spoken language. But grammar is important, right? We can't just ignore it completely.
He's not saying grammar is unimportant, but he believes it should be learned in the context of spoken language, not in isolation. It's about noticing how native speakers use grammar, how they structure sentences, how they express themselves, and then trying to emulate those patterns. It's about learning by doing, by listening, by speaking.
Okay, so we're learning by doing, by immersing ourselves in the language. But what about pronunciation? That can be a real stumbling block for many learners.
He stresses that pronunciation is absolutely crucial for effective communication. If your pronunciation is unclear, it can lead to misunderstandings and frustration. It's like trying to build a house with a faulty foundation. It's going to be shaky and unstable.
So how do we build that solid foundation in pronunciation? What are some of Lundquist's key tips?
He suggests that learners should focus on developing accurate pronunciation from the very beginning. This involves listening carefully to native speakers, mimicking their sounds, and seeking feedback from others. He also recommends using resources like pronunciation guides and recordings to help train your ear and your mouth to produce the sounds of English correctly.
It's about developing that muscle memory, both for your mouth and your ears.
Exactly. And here's where Lundquist challenges another traditional notion of language learning, the idea of distinct beginner, intermediate, and advanced levels.
Wait, he's saying those levels don't really exist. That seems pretty radical.
He argues that when it comes to spoken English, there's really only one level, the language that native speakers use in everyday life.
So no more baby talk for adult language learners. We should be diving straight into authentic English.
That's essentially his point, of course. He acknowledges that beginners will have a limited vocabulary and grammar knowledge. But he believes that even beginners can benefit from hearing and using authentic English, even if they don't understand every single word.
It's about immersing yourself in the language, surrounding yourself with it, even if you're not fully fluent yet.
Exactly. He believes that this exposure will help you develop an ear for the language and pick up new words and structures more quickly. It's like learning to swim by jumping into the deep end.
That's a bold approach,
Yeah.
but I can see the logic behind it. So we're embracing authentic language, working on our pronunciation, and focusing on speaking from the very beginning. But we all need feedback to improve, right? How does Lundquist suggest we get that crucial feedback on our progress?
He believes that feedback is essential for growth and improvement. He suggests seeking feedback on your pronunciation, your grammar, and vocabulary from a variety of sources, teachers, language partners, recordings, and even language learning apps.
It's about being proactive, seeking out opportunities to get feedback, and using that feedback to refine our skills.
Exactly. And this is where technology can play a valuable role in the learning process.
But I thought Lundquist was a bit wary of technology.
He is, but only because he believes that technology can sometimes create a passive learning experience. He encourages learners to use technology in a way that promotes active learning and practice. Think of it as a tool, not a crutch.
Okay, so what are some examples of using technology effectively for language learning?
There are so many possibilities. You can use language learning apps that provide interactive exercises and personalized feedback, record yourself speaking, and then listen back to identify areas for improvement, watch movies and TV shows with subtitles, listen to podcasts and music in English, connect with native speakers online for conversation practice. The list goes on and on.
It's about using technology to supplement our learning, not replace active practice and engagement.
Exactly. It's about being mindful and intentional in how we use technology to support our language learning journey.
So we've talked about the mechanics of learning, the importance of speaking, the value of feedback, but there's one crucial element we haven't addressed yet, the human element.
Ah, yes. Lundquist is adamant that language learning is not just about memorizing words and grammar rules. It's about connecting with people, with culture, with the heart of what makes language meaningful.
It's about finding your voice in English, expressing yourself authentically, and building relationships with others.
Precisely. He encourages learners to step outside their comfort zones, to engage in real-world conversations, to embrace the messiness and the beauty of human interaction.
This is where language learning truly comes alive. It's about bridging cultures, sharing stories, and expanding our horizons.
Exactly. And that's what makes this journey so rewarding.
Stay with us as we continue exploring the fascinating world of spoken English learning in the final part of our deep dive.
It really is. And you know that human connection, that's where Lundquist's emphasis on finding your voice comes in. He believes language learning, it isn't just about sounding like a textbook. It's about expressing your unique personality in English.
That's so important.
Yeah.
Because we all have different ways of speaking, even in our native languages.
Yeah.
So how do we cultivate that? Like individual expression in English.
Lundquist, he encourages us to experiment, to play with the language, to find what feels natural and comfortable for us. He also emphasizes connecting with the culture behind the language. You can't truly understand English, he argues, without understanding the cultures it represents.
That makes total sense. Language and culture are so intertwined, it's like trying to understand a joke without knowing anything about the people who created it. You might get the words, but you'll miss the deeper meaning.
Exactly. So Lundquist encourages us to explore the customs, the traditions, the values, even the humor of English-speaking cultures. That's where the richness of the language comes alive.
It's about seeing the world through a new lens,
Yeah.
experiencing the world from different perspectives. That's what makes language learning so transformative.
Yeah.
But it can also be frustrating at times, right?
Oh, absolutely. And Lundquist is very upfront about that. He reminds us that language learning takes time, it takes effort, and it's full of ups and downs. It's easy to get discouraged if we expect to sound like a native speaker after a few weeks of study.
So patience is key.
Absolutely. And so is self-compassion. Lundquist encourages us to celebrate our progress, no matter how small it may seem, and to embrace our mistakes as opportunities for growth.
Because mistakes are inevitable, right?
Right.
We can't let the fear of making mistakes hold us back from speaking.
Exactly. He believes that mistakes are valuable learning tools. They show us where we need to focus our attention. What areas need more practice?
So it's all about shifting our perspective. Instead of seeing mistakes as failures, we see them as stepping stones on the path to fluency.
Precisely. And that brings us to another key point, the importance of having a positive attitude. Language learning can be challenging at times, but it's so much easier and more enjoyable when we approach it with enthusiasm, curiosity, and a willingness to embrace the journey.
It's like anything else in life, right? Your attitude can make all the difference. If you go into it with a negative mindset,
Yeah.
it's going to be a much harder climb.
Exactly. Lundquist emphasizes the importance of finding joy in the process, of celebrating those small victories, and of remembering why we embarked on this journey in the first place.
And I think that's a great message for our listener today. Learning English doesn't have to be a chore. It can be an adventure.
It really can be. And one thing that can make that adventure a lot smoother is finding a supportive community. Lundquist talks about the value of connecting with other learners, whether it's through language exchange groups, conversation partners,
Right.
or online forums.
Because we're all in this together, right? We can learn from each other,
Yeah.
encourage each other, and celebrate each other's successes.
Exactly. And those shared experiences can make the learning process so much more rewarding.
Well, I think we've covered just about every aspect of Lundquist's approach to learning spoken English. It's been a fascinating deep dive, full of insightful perspectives and practical tips.
It certainly has. And I think the biggest takeaway is that learning English is about so much more than memorizing vocabulary and grammar rules. It's about engaging all of our senses, connecting with people and cultures, and finding our own unique voice in the language.
And it's about having fun along the way.
Absolutely. So to our listener out there, embrace the journey, be patient with yourself, and never stop exploring the fascinating world of English.
Until next time, happy learning.